worship folder. When I put this together this week, Amy, I should point that out. Haley is no longer doing the church secretary stuff. And she has decided she wants to devote more of her time to being mom. And so we forced Amy to do it instead. And Amy, not used to it as much, she, when I put this together right there at the top of the worship folder, she thought I put a "the" between Y and hell. She's like, why would he say that? Actually, it's a good question. Because I have to tell you, I'm going to go a little weird on us this morning. Remember, we've been doing this series on asking ourselves questions about what we believe, what we value, what we practice. We've been looking at these kind of things and asking ourselves these deep questions. And so we're dealing with each of these different categories and different stuff. So this morning we want to talk about eternity. The fact that each of us have an eternal destination, the fact that there is something there afterwards. But for the most part, I don't feel like I have to talk about heaven much. I mean, truthfully, I think most of us, especially in American culture, we just buy it. 80-some-odd% of people in America just assume there is a heaven if you describe it as a place where good people go to be rewarded. But interestingly enough, it's closer to only half the people who think there's a hell. Now, the distinction, I think, is important because I want to address that, and I'm going to spend most of my time this morning talking about why the doctrine of hell is even important. Why we would look at that at all, and what it can teach us about our God. And there's a couple reasons. One, for the 3 in 20 people who believe that there's a heaven but not a hell, I want to be able to address that for those folks. But also because of this deeper reality that I think our misunderstanding of hell actually relates to a misunderstanding of heaven as well. And I think we can learn a lot of great stuff about who God is by looking at this. Now, let me deal with this first of all. When I have people ask me from time to time, say, Bill, do you really believe that there is this fiery hell? And since that's asked from time to time, I was actually impressed this week when listening to another pastor, and he was talking about these things. And matter of fact, I stole a lot of stuff from him for this morning. That his answer would be very similar to mine, which is no. I really do think that this fiery bit of hell is a metaphor. And you can almost see this wash of relief over people's faces until I say, no, I think it's a metaphor for something much, much worse. I think there's something much worse going on. And I want to be able to talk about that this morning. And so I'm going to base it on this one passage. Now, as I read this passage, I'm going to point out a few things because I'm going to refer to it a lot, but instead of reading it multiple times. This passage is here in Luke, and it's a story that Jesus told of Lazarus and the rich man. He says, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. And at his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dog came and licked his sores. The first thing I want to point out, and I'll reference it more, is just this idea. What do you make of the fact that Lazarus gets a name but the rich man doesn't? What do you make of the fact that the rich man is just called the rich man, where Lazarus actually seems to have an identity? Well, the time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up, saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, and I want you to pay particular attention to what he calls for. Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. I am in agony. But Abraham replied, Son, remember... I don't know, I'm not going to point out too much there, but look at that phrase that he starts off with, just son. Remember that in your lifetime you received your good things while Lazarus received bad things, but now he is comforted here and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over there from there to us. And so he answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not come to this place of torment. And Abraham replied, well, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. And he said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they'll not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. So what I'd like to point out is we talk about this nature of hell and why the doctrine of hell and why that I think that's important. The first thing I want to mention, and this first blank in your outline, is it is the result of our chosen identity. See, this is what I make of the fact that the rich man doesn't get a name, but Lazarus does. Because Lazarus is known. Lazarus is who he authentically is. Whatever his station in life, because in the ancient world, the poor, the beggar would have been seen as necessarily less than. So Jesus is certainly making a social commentary that just because you're rich doesn't mean you're blessed by God, and just because you're poor means you're not. But Lazarus is who he fully is. But the rich man is identified only by the fact that he wanted to be rich, that he longed to have luxury clothing, that he ate well, that his identity was wrapped up into this. The reason I think this is important is because I believe hell has everything to do with simply being the result of what it is that we long for and hope for. What we focus on, what we daydream about. In those moments of quiet when we really long for something, what it is that we long for. And from every hint in this story is the rich man longed to be rich. Lazarus was something else. I'm quoting C.S. Lewis a lot. My understanding of hell had been greatly informed, especially as a young person, by the writings of C.S. Lewis. Let me start off with this one. He points out something that's absolutely fascinating. He says, again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever, and this must either be true or false. This has to be either true or false. Now there are a good many things with which we would not be worth bothering if I were going to be living only 70 years. If I was going to only live 70 years, there'd be things just not even worth bothering about. But which if I better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. So if we're only going to be 70 years and that's it and we're done, there are things not even worth considering. But if we're going to live forever, we better consider them. For example, perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse, and so gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable. So of course it doesn't matter. It's not noticeable. Over 70 years, I just got a teeny bit more jealous or a teeny bit more angry, and it's not really noticeable, but it might be absolute hell in 1,000,000 years. And in fact, if Christianity is true, hell is the precisely correct technical term for what that would be. See, what he is arguing here, and I think whatever it is that we truly are, and where our life is pointed, the trajectory of our life, if given just however many years we have, it really doesn't matter. It might not matter much. We might not change perceptibly in the years we are in life. But if we are to live forever and to continue on that trajectory, it would matter immensely. It would matter tremendously. And see, the fascinating thing is I believe it is that God judges on the trajectory of our hearts more than He judges us for our deeds. I mean, granted, our deeds can be a representation of our hearts. But it's certainly fair, because we could come from a horrible background and have learned horrible things, but then made the self-determination to follow God as best as we can, to learn what that means, and allow ourselves to be taken in that direction. But because of when we grew up, because of where we grew up, because of the truth of people that have spoken into our lives, or the lies we have heard, that maybe we're on that path very, very slowly. Where others who were born into a place with maybe a good church and a good Christian family that were able to direct them to the grace of God and had a jump start in their life and were also on that trajectory, but they maybe over the course of their life would have been perceptibly better in some of the virtues. And would it be fair of God to say, well, you were lucky sociologically, demographically, so welcome to heaven, and you didn't quite make the standard, so sorry. No, but the God is judging on the trajectory of our hearts. But not judging in the sense that He stands up and He says, okay, you're going the right direction, come on into heaven, and you're not, I condemn you to hell. But instead, that we are allowed the trajectory of our lives for all of our afterlife as well, that ultimately results in where we're going. So C.S. Lewis talks about, if I had this anger or this temper and over 1 million years and I just let it happen, it would become a hell. Now, I don't know if that fits our minds because we imagine hell with a bunch, demons torturing people, or Dante's Inferno where there are different levels for different sins and you suffer different things. But maybe one of the areas where we understand it because we've either experienced it ourselves or we know somebody is when we look at somebody with an addiction. And we see somebody who's made a choice, maybe imperceptibly, but this addiction, this obsession, whatever, becomes more and more a part of their lives. And they make choices, and the trajectory of their life is to have more and more of that in their lives. And as I talk to people in the throes of addiction, that it's not that they would say, man, this is great. They would admit, no, it's not. This is not what I want. In some imperceptible sense, I would rather have something else, yet I keep making choices over and over. And it is isolating. It is destructive. I had a chance to talk with somebody this week. I said, I'm going to be preaching on this. I'm going to share this. And your experience with addiction, was that true of you? He goes, yeah, it was isolating, but isolating in the sense that I chose the isolation. I didn't want these people in my life because these people, either directly or indirectly, were interfering with my addiction. That I wanted more of that, and so I began to isolate myself. The destruction that I experienced in my life were things that I chose because this was more important to me. That I was choosing this, and so yes, I was caught in a prison, but it was a prison of my own making. Now, I think what we're dealing with is that if we imagine that hell is indeed exactly that, where we are allowed to choose our own direction, that our afterlife isn't limited to heaven and hell in the sense that we come to some place and we go either one or the other, but we are already on a trajectory for one or the other, and we get to experience whatever it is that we are most hoping for now. Again, C.S. Lewis writes this: I willingly believe that the damned are in one sense successful, rebels to the end, that the doors of hell are locked on the inside. I do not mean that the ghosts may not wish to come out of hell in the vague fashion wherein an envious man wishes to be happy, but that they certainly do not will, even the first preliminary stages of that self-abandonment through which alone the soul can reach any good. Again, I'm going to read that again. That may be confusing. They don't choose, they don't will, even the first steps of letting go of themselves, which is the only way that the soul can reach good. They don't even long for that one first step. They enjoy forever the horrible freedom they have demanded and are therefore self-enslaved. Again, the rich man's obsession, his addiction in this story was that he longed to be rich. He longed to have material. He longed to have power and influence by all the world standards of the day. That's what was most important to him. And he continued on that path of self-will, not only through his life, but through his death. And that his experience in hell was exactly a result of the fact that that was his choice. Remember when I pointed out, when he asked, He finally could speak across the chasm, speak to Abraham. What did he ask for? Did he say, get me out of this hell? No. He said, send Lazarus over here to make this easier for me. Give me more so that I have what I want plus more benefits. I want someone else to come make my choices better for me. One more C.S. Lewis quote. If we're still caught in this concept, because I get it, it's everywhere in literature, it's everywhere in our art about this people being cast down to hell and people being accepted into heaven, or there's some like St. Peter at the gate with some scale about how good, and we often think it's based on that because we've been taught that. I have a book in my office called Heaven and Hell in Western Art. One day my son was here and we were having a Bible study, and he was asking, he says, where'd this image of hell come from with demons and fire? I said, well, probably art. I've got a book for Heaven and Hell in Western Art. Would you like to see it? And he goes, man, that's a specific book. Really? They would have a whole book on art by cowboys? I don't understand. Western art, okay. But this imagery, if you're still caught up in it, one more C.S. Lewis quote. In the long run, the answer to all those who object to the doctrine of hell is itself a question. What are you asking God to do? What are you really asking God to do when it comes to this eternal choice that people make? What are you really asking? Are you asking Him to wipe out their past sin and at all costs to give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty and offering every miraculous help? He has done so on Calvary. That's exactly what Jesus' work was. That's exactly what He did. Well, are you asking for Him to forgive them? They will not be forgiven. They don't see anything wrong. Their choice is what they long for. Their freedom is what they want. They don't want to be forgiven. So are you asking Him simply to leave them alone? Well, alas, I'm afraid that's what He has done. Another quote that I didn't put up there is that ultimately, perceptibly, we are left with just two kinds of people in the world, and why we have afterlife that we differentiate between heaven and hell. We have that which says to God, thy will be done. And then the others to which God simply says, okay, thy will be done. It is a choice we make as a result of what we see our core identity, that we are choosing now and forever. So if I've successfully given you this idea, the image of hell is not some prison that bad people are up, that somehow we get to heaven and we say, oh, darn, it's all true. Well, I blew it, now I'm going to hell. I don't think that's it at all. But that we imperceptibly and that we continually go on the path that leads us. I think it's important to understand that. But I think there's another benefit to understanding the doctrine of hell that's not going to sit real well. And that is that it helps us understand the love of God. You see, and I hear the voices in the Pacific Northwest. I hear the voices of Portland saying, no, I get it. I get that maybe it's important that you talk about who we are as people and who we long to be. But isn't that the quintessential opposite of love? I mean, if God really loved us, He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't leave us alone. But see, I think what we see here is if we fail to understand the reality of the doctrine of hell, then we miss out on the love of God. Okay, so you remember the next point, that the rich man speaks to Abraham. First he says, send Lazarus over. Make my agony worse, or not so bad. Make my bad agony just not so bad, just a little bit of refreshment in the midst of what I continue to choose to be and what I continue to choose to do. The next thing he says is, well, let me think about my brothers. Send somebody back from the dead, Lazarus, send him back from the dead, and let my brothers see him. And the response was, it's not going to work. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. And he says, no. But if somebody comes back from the dead, then they'll really change. They'll repent. They'll live differently. And again, he says, nope. They're not going to be convinced. And it's not a rational convince. And the word in Greek isn't just about believing something they didn't believe. It's about really being changed. He says it's not going to happen. If they can't do that from Moses and the prophets, they can't do it through Scripture, then they're not going to be able to do it simply because somebody raises from the dead. And here's this point. See, if Lazarus came back, certainly his brothers, knowing Lazarus is dead, and all of a sudden they see him show up at the doorstep, they talk, it would probably life-affecting. Oh my, this heaven and hell thing is real, and I've got to live this out, and I don't want to go to hell, so I'm going to change how I live, and not like this rich man. I'm going to start doing moral stuff and good stuff, and I'm going to be that guy, and this way I can avoid what I've seen and experienced, and that Lazarus has told me about. I want to avoid that, but the powerful and horrible aspect of this is fear of hell is not enough to keep us out of it. What's the greatest problem in our world? It's me. It's I want me. I want me over you. I want me instead of you. It is this incredible selfishness that says all other things literally be damned. What I want is most important. What I can get, what I long for, is of most value. And knowing that there's a hell and beginning to change how I live just to avoid hell is still that same route. I may look better on the outside. I may be kinder. I may be more generous. I may give. But at the root, I am still the incredibly selfish me that I've always been. Instead of making my wager between you and hoping I get my stuff, now my wager is with God. And I'm going to, well, God, I did all the right things. Now you owe me heaven. You owe me to go to the right place. And it's still incredibly self-centered. I'm not being good for goodness sakes. I'm not being good for the sake of being able to please God. I'm trying to be good so that I get what I want and my just rewards. It doesn't solve that central problem. I'm simply a moralist. I hope I can get you to understand this, because most of the interactions I've had with atheists online, as well as conversations I have and look at the website, this is the description of basic Christianity, that somehow I am controlling you. As a pastor, I control you because I have made you sufficiently scared of hell that I can make sure you do what I want you to do and give me money. That's the idea. That's what you're thinking, right? And if that is what you're thinking, my lawn needs to be mowed. Okay? Anybody? Yeah, good luck with that. Exactly. But that's the belief that so many from the outside, as they look on the church, and rightfully maybe, or truthfully, maybe even some of us here who believe what we're really trying to do is live a life of fire insurance, of trying to make it, to live in such a way that we somehow reach the bar of good enough that says, good, God will reward us with heaven. But that's not the way it works. Ultimately, what is hell? It is the absence of the presence of God. It's where we get what we've asked for, which is just our own freedom and our own power and our own stuff. That we care more about us than anything else. Or there's the presence of God that we say, thy will be done. And if that's the case, then something profound happened at Calvary when Jesus died on the cross. You see, I cringe a little bit at the stories of the Passion. It's been going on for centuries. We have the Passion story of Oberammergau. We certainly do stories every now and then about the Passion of Christ. And we see and we go over and over through the horrific torture he had up to the cross. And we talk about the sufferings of Christ. And I tell you, I don't think that's the suffering. I'm not saying it wasn't suffering. It was clearly suffering. But chances are we could find more gruesome torture stories in human history. The suffering was at the moment of the cross when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? you have a really good relationship with your friends and your friends forsake you, that's going to hurt. It's going to hurt more if it comes from your spouse, your mom, your dad. I mean, the closer this relationship we have, the more we long for it, the more it hurts. And Jesus, as part of the Trinity, in the perfect and holy relationship, has this moment where he separates, where he is forsaken by God, where he takes on the sin of the world, and he experiences in that moment a break in relationship that is greater than any hell you and I could ever experience for all of eternity. He suffered more at that moment on a cosmic level that we will never understand. And he literally experienced hell out of his love for you. Out of his willingness to say, I will do this. Here, the passage in Isaiah. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain. He bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. He suffered not only with us, but for us. Everything we might experience in our separation from God, he suffered more deeply. And he has done that for the sake of being able to say, I can be a just and loving God and catch that loving part. You see, I know the tendency to just say, God, I can't picture this God that would allow that to happen. I'm imagining instead a God that just forgives us, that just says, oh, it's okay, it doesn't really matter, what the things you did, no big deal. But I think in our attempt to try to create a loving God like that, we create a God who doesn't love us very much at all. Let me put it this way. When I hear people who have that image of God and I ask them, what did it cost God to love you? Well, it didn't cost him anything. He just does. Whereas the image of the cross and the doctrine of hell say, God experienced more than you and I ever will for the sake of loving you. He spent an incredible amount of pain and suffering to heal us. Lastly, then, to bring it full circle, heaven is just the antithesis. It's a big fancy word that means opposite. I don't know why I remember thinking through this and deliberately avoided the word opposite, and for the life of me couldn't remember this morning why. But I wanted to get that it's not just because it's a whole new frame of looking. It is not just this repentance that the rich man wanted for his brothers just to change how they live. Because ultimately, if our central issue is that pain or is that willingness that it's me over everything else, how do we change that? I mean, if we can't just, I'm going to live more generously, but that's still really for us. I mean, how can we possibly change? If we're trapped either way, if we live for ourselves, then we go that for eternity and that's hell. Or if we say, I'm going to live for God, I'm going to do all the right things, but really it's for myself, that's the trajectory of selfishness that doesn't lead. How could I possibly change? And I think the only thing is in a radical kind of love that ultimately says, at our root, despite all our brokenness, despite all false starts, despite the fact that it's so hard, that we just say, God, I know I failed again, and I've chosen me over you, I've chosen me over them, I keep doing it, but Lord, that's not really deeply in my heart what I want. Help me to be who you want me to be. Thy will be done. Heaven is the presence of God. That means a couple of really radical things. One, it means if you really don't want God, you really don't want heaven. You just don't. There's nothing that heaven can offer you if you don't want to be with God. If that's not your primary goal in life, it's not going to offer you a thing. But the other thing is, if it is the primary call of your life, every moment you get in prayer and worship, every time you get a connection with spiritual truth or feel that love of God, you are experiencing heaven on earth. You are beginning to live out the reality of your eternity. But as always, let's just start with the question. Do you buy it? Do you believe it? Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms, and if that were not so, I would have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go, this is Jesus talking, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and I will take you to be with me, so that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going. So do you buy it? Do I believe that there is a heaven and a hell, and that Jesus Christ is returning to judge the earth and to establish his eternal kingdom? Do I believe that? Let's spend some time in open worship just considering that question. Share if God places something on your heart. In a couple minutes, I'll close this in prayer.